Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Research Podcast. We are diving deep today into some absolutely critical and frankly quite intense developments happening right now. We're talking about the really significant escalation between Israel and Iran.
That's right. We've got a stack of material here, specifically excerpts from a recent YouTube transcript on the Summary channel. It covers the latest actions, stated intentions, and the frankly complex and, well, dangerous dynamics at play. The source itself frames this moment as entering a very dangerous phase of conflict.
Yeah. And our mission in this deep dive is to cut through the noise, understand what this source is highlighting as the key pieces of information, and figure out what's truly important for you to know right now, according to the material we're looking at. So let's jump right in and unpack this, because wow, there's a lot going on.
Okay. Let's start by setting the scene. The source kicks off by detailing some pretty striking statements coming directly from the Iranian side. It's worth noting the perspective of the source timing here. It was recorded specifically anticipating a potential strike tonight, which gives you a sense of the immediate tension, that anticipation at the moment the source was created. So what were the specific threats being issued by Iran according to this material?
Yeah, the Iranian defense minister had some really explicit threats, and importantly, they were conditional. As reported in this transcript, he stated that Iran would attack all U.S. military bases throughout the Middle East. But that wasn't the whole story. The condition was crucial. This would happen if the United States assists Israel in defending against Iran's expected response.
Right, so it's a direct, calculated warning to Washington. Help Israel defend itself in this moment, and you become a target. And the source makes it clear this isn't limited to U.S. bases. The threat also explicitly extends to British and French bases in the region. They would also be targeted if they provide assistance to Israel.
So they're drawing a very clear red line based on external military intervention to support Israel's defense in this specific scenario. Is that the gist?
Precisely. That's exactly how the source frames it. According to the report, the defense minister went further, sending a message specifically to Washington, stating that things would reach the point of conflict if ongoing negotiations don't yield results. And he backed this up with a claim. If armed conflict is imposed on Iran, the United States, he asserted, would suffer greater losses.
That's incredibly high-stakes language, essentially daring the U.S. to get involved or risk a wider confrontation. And the source also mentions the IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, right? Their stance was included.
Yes. The source reports a significant vow from the IRGC. They stated they would launch new waves of missiles, emphasizing that the number could exceed 2,000. Now, that's a significant number, implying a scale potentially much larger than previous exchanges. And they weren't just talking about a single volley. They explicitly stated the operation would continue for as long as necessary. Ben Fay. This is presented in the source as the declared reactive posture from the Iranian side, their public narrative of how they intend to respond and sustain pressure.
Okay. So to everyone listening, why is it important to know these specific conditional threats as laid out in this source material? What does this tell you?
Well, understanding these specifics as detailed here is crucial because it reveals Iran's publicly stated red lines and, strategic focus in this moment. It makes it clear that their declared intent is heavily aimed at deterring external intervention, particularly from the U.S., U.K., and France, should they choose to aid Israel's defense. It helps you understand the specific parameters of their publicly articulated strategy within this particular confrontation, according to this source. It's not just general saber-rattling. It's tied to specific actions they are warning against. Makes sense?
Yeah, totally. Okay, that sets the stage for Iran's position. Now let's pivot to the other side. The source talks about Israel moving into a second phase. What does that actually mean in the context of this material?
Well, the source describes Israel's actions as a significant and distinct escalation. It explicitly states they are entering what it calls a very dangerous stage in the confrontation with Iran. It frames this as a clear shift from previous actions, a real stepping up of the conflict.
And the rhetoric coming from Netanyahu, quoted in the source, is incredibly bold and, frankly, attention-grabbing. He's quoted as saying, "We have paved the way to Tehran," and went on to predict that Israeli planes will soon be over the Iranian capital. Wow. He vowed to hit every site and target of the mullah's regime and added the striking line, "This is zero compared to what they will feel under the strike of our arm in the coming days." That's not subtle language, is it?
Right. It's fascinating here how direct, how forceful, and almost triumphant the language is presented in the source. It clearly signals a major shift in Israel's stated intentions and perceived confidence level, according to this material. It goes beyond talking about defensive measures to projecting offensive capability and intent deep inside Iran. The source also mentions Netanyahu asserting that they are working forcefully to remove what he describes as a double threat to Israel.
The sheer boldness of saying, we have paved the way to Tehran, and predicting planes over the capital, that just leaps out from the source material. It really does feel like a different level of public declaration than we might have seen before.
Sure. Absolutely. It validates the source's framing of this as a definitive move into a new, potentially much more dangerous phase. It's not just about responding to attacks anymore. It's about communicating an intent to project power and influence the core of the Iranian regime, as Israel is articulating it here. And that kind of rhetoric has its own strategic purpose, of course. It's meant to be heard.
Okay, so with that context of stated intent and entering a second phase, let's move into what Israel is actually doing on the ground, or more accurately, in the air, based on this source. One of the most significant claims presented in the transcript is about air superiority.
Yes, this is a key military detail highlighted by the source. It reports a specific announcement by the Israeli army claiming they have achieved freedom of movement for their aircraft, specifically in western Iran, which is the large region facing the Arab Gulf.
Freedom of movement for aircraft. What does that actually imply in this context, according to the source's interpretation? Because that sounds like a very significant claim.
It is. Oh, yeah. The source interprets this as a very dangerous but militarily significant declaration. What it means, implicitly, is that Israel is claiming it has successfully destroyed or neutralized Iran's air defense capabilities in that specific, vast area. When you talk about air defenses, you're typically talking about the layered systems of radar that track incoming aircraft and missiles, and surface-to-air missile batteries, SAMs, designed to shoot them down. If Israel is claiming freedom of movement, they are saying these systems in western Iran are no longer an effective threat to their planes.
Whoa. So, to everyone listening, why is gaining this claimed air superiority in western Iran such a big deal based on the analysis in this source? What's the strategic implication here?
Well, think about the geography and the potential targets, right? Western Iran is a vast territory. It's home to significant infrastructure, including energy facilities, ports, and potentially military or nuclear-related sites further inland. Achieving claimed air superiority there, if true, dramatically alters the strategic landscape. It really does. It opens up entirely new possibilities for sustained strikes closer to Iran's core infrastructure, its population centers, and potentially even more sensitive sites, without facing effective resistance from ground-based air defenses in that region. It's like removing a major layer of protection over a huge area of the country, according to this source's interpretation.
And what did this claimed freedom of movement then enable Israel to do, according to the source material? What actions did they take as a result of this?
The source details that this claimed capability allowed Israel to deploy additional air capabilities into the area, and notably it mentions the use of suicide drones launched directly from Israel. Now, this is a really interesting detail because the source specifies they were launched from Israel itself, not from neighboring countries or covertly from within Iranian territory in these specific instances. This detail about the launch origin is highlighted, which is interesting.
Okay, now this is where, based on the source, the strategic shift gets really clear and potentially quite impactful. What were the specific targets of these drones and air capabilities operating with this claimed freedom of movement? Because it sounds like there's a major move away from just hitting military bases.
You are absolutely right. The targets listed in the source indicate a very clear and significant strategic shift in Israel's campaign. They weren't just hitting the usual military installations. No, the targets included, first, the Yas gas field, located in western Iran, hitting energy production directly. Big target. Second, and this is highlighted as significant, Iran's largest refinery, which was reportedly hit by these drones. This is a critical piece of national infrastructure. Huge. Third, they broadened the targets to include energy infrastructure more generally. This involves striking power stations, gas stations, and other oil fields. And fourth, Iranian ports in western Iran. The source specifically mentions the Kankan port near Bushehr. It also adds context about Bushehr, noting it has an older reactor built during the Shah's era, which is primarily used for power generation. Not heavily involved in the nuclear weapons program, according to the analysis within this specific material, but still, hitting a port near it sends a message.
Wow. So, hitting gas fields, the country's biggest refinery, power stations, ports. This isn't just about military force on force anymore. It's like they're going after the fundamental infrastructure that powers the country's economy and daily life, its fuel tank, its power grid, its ability to trade and move goods. Is that the idea?
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. That's precisely the interpretation and significance drawn in the source material. It goes well beyond what might be considered a limited, preemptive military strike against military assets, as the source explicitly describes it. The scale, scope, and nature of these targets are presented as indicative of what the source characterizes as a full military campaign being conducted by Israel. The analysis within the source suggests that the apparent strategic intent here is to inflict damage that could set Iran back not just days or weeks, but potentially several years in terms of economic function and national capacity. That's a major claim.
And the source even cited some Iranian media reports that seem to corroborate at least one of these attacks.
Yes. The source mentions that Iranian media confirmed a strong explosion occurred at the Kankan port in Bushehr. This detail provides some external corroboration, cited within the source, for at least one of the specific infrastructure targets mentioned as having been hit. It adds a layer of detail to the report.
Okay, so we've covered the stated threats, the escalation, the claims of air superiority, and the specific impactful targets being hit. Now, let's connect this military pressure campaign to the diplomatic side, particularly the nuclear program, because the source links these explicitly. The New York Times, as cited in the source, poses a critical question. Can a nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran even happen anymore in this climate of intense military action?
That is indeed a key question raised and explored in the material. And the analysis from the New York Times, as presented in this source, is quite fascinating because it directly links Israel's recent military actions, specifically the targeted assassinations, to the evolving diplomatic landscape surrounding a potential nuclear deal. What's really interesting here is how the source integrates the assassinations into this diplomatic analysis. Quite a strategic view.
How do these assassinations of IRGC leaders play into the possibility or lack thereof of a nuclear deal, according to the NY2 analysis cited in the source?
Well, the New York Times point, as relayed in this transcript, is that Israel's campaign of assassinating key IRGC leaders was specifically focused on those individuals who were the biggest, most influential opponents within Iran of reaching a nuclear deal with the United States. These weren't just military targets in the traditional sense. These individuals reportedly held significant sway and influence, specifically impressing the supreme leader against pursuing such an agreement.
So the strategy, according to this analysis, was to remove the most powerful voices, blocking a deal from within the Iranian system. Is that what they're suggesting?
Precisely. The source specifically highlights the assassination of the IRGC leader, who is considered the most influential opponent of a deal. The NYT analysis, as presented here, frames this particular assassination as having potentially opened the door for the supreme leader, suggesting that if he were indeed inclined towards pursuing an agreement, a major internal obstacle had been removed. It's a pretty calculated perspective.
And the source adds points from other significant outlets too, right? Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy. How do they build on this picture?
Yes. The source cites analysis from the Wall Street Journal and an article in Foreign Policy written by an Iranian analyst. These reports, as presented in this transcript, reinforce the idea that the supreme leader now has limited options when it comes to experienced and highly competent commanders following these losses. The implication drawn in the source is significant. If Israel were to continue targeting the newer, less experienced commanders who replace those lost, the supreme leader might find himself with no alternatives, left a significant leadership void within his military and strategic command structures, basically running out of experienced people.
If we connect all these points to the bigger picture presented in the source, this analysis suggests that by systematically targeting commanders and simultaneously hitting critical infrastructure, Israel might be trying to back the supreme leader into a corner, a position where he concludes Iran simply cannot effectively defend its nuclear program or its national assets against this kind of sustained, precise pressure.
That appears to be a core piece of the strategic analysis being presented in the source. Yes. The thinking, as described here, is that the cumulative effect of losing key, capable leaders and seeing vital national and nuclear-related facilities hit could lead the supreme leader to a stark realization. The military resistance or deterrence, at least in its current form, is no longer a viable option for protecting his strategic programs, including the nuclear one. It's a strategy of combined pressure, really, trying to force a change in calculus.
Speaking of nuclear facilities specifically, did the source mention the actual physical impact of these strikes on those sites? What did they actually hit?
Yes, the source addresses this directly. It refers to reporting by journalist Barak Ravid, who reportedly showed photos indicating that the core facilities at Natanz, specifically the ones located above ground, were destroyed in recent strikes.
Okay, but Natanz also has those significant deep underground facilities, which are much harder to hit, right? They're still okay.
That's correct. And the source notes that the underground facilities at Natanz are believed to be intact. It also mentions that the Fordo facility, another key underground site, is stated as still being intact in the source material. So the deep stuff is probably safe. However, the source adds a crucial point to consider. Even with the underground sites intact, Israel will likely keep playing with Iranian nuclear facilities, suggesting a strategy of continued targeting, harassment, or attempts to disrupt operations at related or above-ground sites, even if they can't reach the deepest parts, just keeping the pressure on.
So is Israel's goal here to completely destroy the nuclear program, or is there a different objective at play based on the source's analysis? Because hitting above-ground facilities while leaving underground ones intact suggests, well, something else, doesn't it?
This raises an important question, and it's where we see what appears to be a significant contradiction highlighted within the source itself. While Israel's actions, the targeting of infrastructure, the striking of above-ground nuclear sites, look like an attempt at destruction.
Yeah.
The source cites an estimate from Channel 12, a major Israeli news outlet, which concluded that Israel cannot completely destroy the Iranian nuclear program, and that ultimately the entire issue will end with an agreement.
Wait a minute, an Israeli source is saying they can't fully destroy it and predicts a deal, while simultaneously Israel is conducting what the source calls a full military campaign, hitting all these critical targets. How does the source reconcile that? That sounds odd.
Exactly. It seems counterintuitive on the surface, doesn't it? The source synthesizes this apparent contradiction by suggesting that all of Israel's actions hitting gas fields, ports, refineries, power plants, military sites, assassinating commanders, and even targeting above-ground nuclear infrastructure are primarily understood as overwhelming pressure tactics. The overarching goal, as interpreted within this material, is not necessarily the physical obliteration of the underground program, which is seen as too difficult, perhaps impossible, but rather to create such immense pain, cost, and disruption for Iran that it is forced back to the negotiating table for a nuclear deal. The destruction and the assassinations are viewed through the lens of creating maximum leverage for a diplomatic outcome, essentially offering an off-ramp from the escalating conflict they initiated. It's about leverage.
And there was a concrete diplomatic consequence that immediately followed these actions, wasn't there? Talks were actually canceled.
Yes. Based on the source, the planned U.S. Iran nuclear talks that were scheduled to take place in Muscat, Oman, were formally canceled. The Omani foreign minister reportedly made the announcement, so boom, talks off.
And what reason did Iran give for canceling? According to the source material, why pull out?
The Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Iraqi, as cited in the source, stated clearly and publicly that the talks had no justification left after the recent Israeli attacks. Crucially, he explicitly attributed these attacks to direct U.S. support, according to the source material. That's the key linkage they made.
So Iran is publicly refusing to negotiate, explicitly framing the Israeli attacks as U.S.-backed pressure that makes talks impossible right now.
That is precisely the Iranian public stance presented in the source. Yeah. The source also adds that an American official is quoted stating that Washington still wants to hold these talks despite Iran's current refusal. This shows the immediate diplomatic impasse created by the military actions, kind of a standoff.
Mm-hmm. This highlights just how intertwined military action and diplomacy are in this conflict. It's not separate tracks. Actions on the ground, as reported here, have immediate, tangible effects on the possibility of diplomatic engagement.
What's fascinating here is how the source connects these disparate elements.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not just a military report or a diplomatic report. It's showing how the military actions are strategically aimed at altering the diplomatic landscape and how the diplomatic side is reacting directly to the military pressure. It's a very dynamic and potentially dangerous feedback loop.
Okay, shifting gears again. If Iran is making all these big threats, talking about 2,000+ missiles, continuing as long as necessary, why might they be delaying a major response? Or why might they be in a weaker position than their rhetoric suggests? The source brings in analysis from Daniel Byman on this point.
Right. Daniel Byman's analysis, as mentioned in the source, introduces a key strategic concept here. The longer Iran delays a significant large-scale response, the more its strategic opportunities and potential advantages decrease. The element of surprise or, hitting Israel when its defenses are less prepared diminishes over time. Windows close.
And the source talks about why Israel might have felt confident escalating to this phase 2 in the first place. What analysis supports that? Why take the risk?
Yes, the source's analysis points to a perceived lack of decisive or overwhelming action from Iranian proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen in previous rounds of tension or conflict. This relative inaction, according to the source, might have signaled to Israel that Iran's main existing military plans or priorities were not primarily focused on launching immediate, devastating attacks directly on Israel itself. Instead, the source suggests Iran's core strategic plans were perhaps more geared towards hitting American targets in the region, foreign bases involved with the U.S., or controlling strategic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. Different priorities, perhaps.
That's a critical insight from the source. It shifts the focus from Iran's sheer capability to its preparedness, its priorities, and potentially its willingness to fully engage its main arsenal against specific targets like Israel in this moment.
Absolutely. It suggests Israel made a calculated gamble based on its assessment of Iran's immediate strategic posture and readiness for a direct, all-out confrontation with Israel. The source presents a key lesson derived from this whole confrontation so far. Intelligence and espionage are arguably more powerful than missiles.
More powerful than missiles. How does the source explain that seemingly counterintuitive idea? That sounds provocative.
The source uses a striking example to illustrate this. Israel reportedly assassinating targets inside Iran using explosive drones. This tactic requires extremely precise, high-level intelligence to locate and successfully target specific individuals deep within enemy territory, bypassing extensive security measures. The source suggests that knowing where and how to strike a high-value target with such precision, enabled by superior intelligence and espionage networks, is ultimately more decisive and strategically impactful than simply possessing a large arsenal of brute force missiles. It highlights precision, knowledge, and covert capability over raw firepower in this specific context, according to the source's analysis. Knowing beats having, in a way.
That really flips the script on how we often think about military power. It's not just about the hardware you possess, but the quality of your information and your ability to use it precisely.
Yeah. It raises an important question about the evolving nature of power and conflict in the modern era, as highlighted in this material. If you have the intelligence and the covert means to hit targets precisely deep inside enemy territory, you could potentially achieve strategic goals with less overt force, fewer resources, and potentially less risk of immediate massive retaliation compared to large-scale conventional strikes. It's a different kind of warfare.
What about external support for Iran? Does the source shed light on who's backing them, and if that support is a limiting factor in this confrontation? Who are their friends here?
Yes. The source provides an assessment of Iran's key international partners in this context. China is described as taking a hands-off approach or maintaining a stance of neutrality regarding this specific conflict, staying out of it, basically.
Okay. And Russia. We hear a lot about Russia and Iran collaborating, especially with drones for Ukraine. What about support to Iran?
This is particularly interesting, as presented in the source, because the dynamic appears reversed in this context. It's quite surprising. The source states that Russia actually needs weapons from Iran, specifically mentioning drones, likely for its own conflicts, and is not providing significant military aid to Iran in this moment. The source speculates that this apparent lack of robust military support from Russia, potentially including advanced air defense systems like the S-300 or S-400 that Iran has long sought, might be a significant contributing factor to the apparent issues with Iran's air defenses in western Iran that allowed Israel to claim freedom of movement there. It might explain the gap.
So the picture painted in the source is that despite having potential allies, Iran isn't receiving significant material military support from its major partners in this current confrontation. And in fact, the flow of military goods is going from Iran to Russia. That's not what you'd maybe expect.
That's the assessment presented here regarding key partners like Russia and China.
Yeah.
And understanding that context, as laid out in the source, is crucial for you to grasp Iran's potential strategic limitations and vulnerabilities as described in this material. It suggests Iran might be more isolated in this specific conflict than its broader geopolitical alliances might imply. They might be feeling quite alone right now.
What about Iran's missile capacity itself? They're threatening these new waves, maybe over 2,000. How much can they actually throw at Israel or other targets? The source gives some estimates.
Right, the numbers are big. The source cites estimates from various intelligence assessments, suggesting Iran possesses a significant arsenal believed to be between 3,000 and 5,000 ballistic missiles. That's a lot. It also notes that Iran is reportedly developing new missile packages with varying ranges, capable of hitting targets from short distances, like 45 kilometers, up to long distances, like 4,000 kilometers, putting much of the region and even parts of Europe potentially within reach. And U.S. estimates cited in the source further suggest that some of these ballistic missiles are designed to carry nuclear warheads, indicating the potential strategic capability of this arsenal down the line.
Okay, that's clearly a lot of missiles, representing a serious potential threat on paper. But the source also raises a critical question about sustainability, right? It's not an infinite supply. They can't just keep firing.
Exactly, that's a key point. The source poses the crucial question. How long can Iran realistically sustain high-intensity strikes or continue responding forcefully with these strategic weapons? It makes the vital point that each strike, especially large-scale ones, depletes Iran's strategic reserves. This arsenal, while significant, is not an endless supply that can be fired indefinitely without consequence. The source interprets Israel's core gamble in this confrontation as the belief that the combination of military pressure and the depletion of these strategic missile resources will force Iran to yield, de-escalate, or return to the negotiating table for a deal before its arsenal is completely exhausted or before it can inflict unacceptable damage on Israel. It's a gamble on resources.
So according to this analysis, the conflict is, in a way, a race against time and against Iran's strategic missile reserves. Who runs out first, essentially?
That appears to be a core part of the strategic calculus presented in the source. Yes. Can Israel's pressure campaign achieve its objectives, whether forcing negotiations or degrading capabilities before Iran expends too much of its arsenal? Or conversely, can Iran withstand the pressure and inflict enough cost on Israel before its resources are gone? It's a very high-stakes strategic calculation being made.
Could Iran have a surprise card up its sleeve, something unexpected that could change the dynamic quickly? A secret weapon or tactic?
The source considers this possibility. It suggests that the key indicator for whether Iran possesses such an unrevealed capability, a surprise card, as the source phrases it would be, if Israel starts taking heavy, significant losses. If Israel sustains major damage, high casualties, or hits to critical infrastructure that it hasn't anticipated in future exchanges, it might signal that Iran used something previously unknown or significantly underestimated by Israeli intelligence. That would be the proof.
And if Israel doesn't take heavy losses, what's the implication then, according to the source, if Iran's response doesn't inflict major pain?
Well, the source's analysis suggests that if Israel continues to avoid heavy casualties or major strategic setbacks from Iran's response, it will likely become even more emboldened in its actions and demands. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And the source indicates that a significant part of Israel's strategy is to actively use its lobbying efforts internationally and domestically, and to hope for strategic mistakes from Iran that are so blatant or damaging that they would trigger direct U.S. military intervention against Iran. That, according to this material, appears to be a significant potential goal for Israel in this escalating situation, drawing the U.S. into the fight.
So the Israeli goal, as analyzed in this source, isn't only to pressure Iran into a deal through direct military action, but potentially also to create conditions that would prompt the United States to engage militarily against Iran. That's a whole other level of strategic thinking.
That is indeed one of the strategic possibilities outlined and discussed in the source's analysis. It paints a picture of different layers of strategy and potential desired outcomes being pursued simultaneously by Israel in this confrontation, not just one simple goal.
Let's step back even further and look at some of the broader, perhaps more unsettling context discussed in the source. There's a fascinating and potentially disturbing point raised about this conflict, potentially taking on the characteristics of a religious war, citing analyst Stephen Cook.
Yes, this is a striking and concerning point presented in the source material. It definitely catches your attention. And the evidence cited to support this claim is quite stark and specific. The source mentions a report and even reportedly shows an image of an Iranian missile that landed in Israel, carrying a very specific inscription, a Quranic verse, specifically Surah 8, verse 17.
Wow. To put a Quranic verse on a missile, that's a powerful and provocative act. That really changes the framing, doesn't it?
It is. It really is. And the source makes the point that both sides are reportedly using religious scripture on their missiles, whether Quranic verses from the Iranian side or verses from the Torah from the Israeli side. This, according to the source and the analysis it cites, adds a deeply concerning and potentially dangerous religious dimension to the conflict, framing it in existential terms for those involved. It raises the stakes emotionally and ideologically.
Now, it's crucial here, as we always do, to state explicitly that we are simply reporting on the content, the analysis, and the specific details presented in this specific source material. We are not endorsing the viewpoint that this is solely or primarily a religious war or the use of religious symbolism in warfare by any side. Okay, we are simply conveying neutrally and partially what the provided material contains and how it's being interpreted within that context, just laying out what the source says.
Exactly. That's crucial. Our role is to present what the source says, including potentially controversial or sensitive points like this, so you can understand the full narrative and analysis it contains. Without us injecting our own opinions or endorsements, we stick to the material provided.
Okay. Beyond the religious aspect, the source also discusses the potential political implications of this conflict, particularly in terms of who might benefit domestically and internationally if Israel is perceived as achieving a victory or gaining the upper hand. Who wins politically?
Right. The source looks at the potential political outcomes of an Israeli victory, or at least a perceived strategic success in this phase. One point is about the domestic political scene in Israel. A perceived victory or successful handling of this escalation could potentially allow Netanyahu to remain in power, perhaps even indefinitely, overcoming current political challenges he faces. Could be a political lifeline.
And in the U.S., the analysis connects this to Donald Trump. How does that work?
Yes. The source's analysis suggests that Donald Trump could view this scenario a weakened Iran, subjected to pressure, without direct U.S. military involvement so far as politically favorable. He might see this as an opportunity to achieve a favorable nuclear deal from a significantly weakened Iran should he return to office. The source notes that Trump's preference, according to this analysis, is often for a weakened Iranian regime that he can negotiate with from a position of strength, rather than seeing the regime completely collapse, which could lead to instability and chaos. And the current conflict scenario, as presented in the source, is seen as particularly advantageous for Trump because it achieves this weakening of Iran without requiring direct U.S. military involvement so far, which aligns with his preference for avoiding costly foreign wars. It fits a certain political narrative.
And the source uses a specific example to illustrate this point about the benefits of avoiding direct U.S. involvement.
Yes, the source highlights the recent example of Jordan shooting down Iranian drones during Iran's retaliatory strike, that specific incident.
How does Jordan shooting down drones connect to the broader political point about avoiding direct U.S. involvement? What's the link?
Well, the source's reasoning is that this type of regional action, where countries like Jordan actively participate in countering Iranian threats, demonstrates that other regional partners are willing and able to take on some of the burden. This means the primary responsibility and risk don't fall solely on the United States, and crucially, it allows the U.S. to avoid directly entering a military conflict with Iran. This is seen as crucial, according to the source's analysis, because direct U.S. military entry into a war with Iran would likely drag many Gulf states into the conflict as well, potentially destabilizing the entire region. This is particularly pertinent given the source's assessment that Iran currently appears very weak and potentially vulnerable to a broader attack, making the consequences of a wider war even more unpredictable and dangerous. So regional partners stepping up is seen as key.
So the political analysis presented here suggests that the current dynamic, where regional players are involved in countering Iran, but the U.S. is not directly engaged in kinetic military action, is seen by some as a strategically preferable outcome because it pressures Iran while potentially limiting the risk of a wider immediate regional war involving the U.S. and its Gulf allies, at least for now. Is that a fair summary?
That's the strategic logic presented in this source's political analysis.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's about managing the conflict and leveraging regional partners in a way that maximizes pressure on Iran, while potentially minimizing the direct cost or broader regional entanglement for the United States and its immediate Gulf allies, according to the specific analysis we're looking at.
Wow. This deep dive really pulls back the curtain on the multi-layered nature of this conflict. It's not just military strikes and counterstrikes. Not by a long shot. It's a complex web of strategic threats, calculated pressure tactics, rapidly shifting diplomatic maneuvers, deep-seated political calculations impacting both domestic and international leaders, and potentially even disturbing religious undertones, all viewed through the specific, detailed lens of the source material. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. What's fascinating here is seeing how the source attempts to tie all these elements together. The specific targets chosen, the diplomatic reactions, the perceived internal vulnerabilities of Iran, the external political dynamics at play, and even the symbolism being used. It paints a compelling, albeit concerning and highly complex, picture of a conflict that is much more than just kinetic action. So much going on beneath the surface.
So as we wrap things up, let's just recap some of the most critical takeaways we've extracted and explored for you from this detailed source material. Just the key points.
Right. Good idea. We've seen the declared escalation by Israel into what the source characterizes as a full military campaign moving beyond limited strikes to target vital national infrastructure like refineries, ports, and power stations, with the apparent goal of setting Iran back years. That's a major point. We've explored Iran's specific conditional threats aimed explicitly at deterring external intervention from the U.S., U.K., and France, and the IRGC's vow of launching sustained missile waves, potentially exceeding 2,000, emphasizing the long-term nature of their intended response. We've examined the direct link drawn in the source between Israel's military pressure, including targeted assassinations of key IRGC figures seen as opponents of a nuclear deal, and the concrete, immediate cancellation of U.S. Iran nuclear talks, with Iran explicitly blaming perceived U.S. support for the attacks. The diplomacy just stopped.
And we've discussed the analysis presented in the source regarding Iran's potential strategic vulnerabilities, from the claimed destruction of air defenses in western Iran, enabling Israeli freedom of movement, which is huge, to the potential depletion of strategic missile reserves with each strike, the analysis suggesting limitations in experienced leadership after targeted assassinations, and the apparent lack of strong material military support from major allies like Russia and China in this specific confrontation. They seem kind of alone based on this source.
Yeah, that's a key theme. We've also touched on the source's fascinating point about intelligence and espionage being potentially more critical than missiles in this conflict, illustrated by the example of precision drone strikes inside Iran, and the complex political calculations discussed, from Netanyahu's potential domestic gain to Donald Trump's perspective on a weakened negotiating partner, and the strategic advantage seen in involving regional partners like Jordan to avoid direct U.S. military intervention. And of course, the concerning dimension, highlighted in the source of the conflict, potentially taking on religious undertones, evidenced by the use of scripture on missiles by both sides. That's a really worrying development.
It's a complex tapestry of events and analysis, and it paints a picture of a rapidly evolving and highly volatile situation seen through the specific, detailed perspective of this source material.
This really does raise some important questions for you to consider as you process this information, drawing directly from the analysis presented in these sources. Given the apparent contradiction highlighted within the material, where an Israeli source estimates the conflict will ultimately end in a deal, while the Iranian foreign minister is currently refusing talks, citing U.S.-backed attacks, and considering the strategic gambles involved regarding resource depletion versus potential surprise cards, what does this deep dive into the material suggest about the most likely trajectory for this conflict in the near term? How probable is it to de-escalate and revert to serious negotiation, versus continuing on a path of escalating military action, despite the reported vulnerabilities of one or both sides? And how does the emphasis the source places on intelligence, precision strikes, and covert operations, as opposed to traditional military power, change how we might think about the nature of conflict and power dynamics in the Middle East going forward? Something to really chew on.
And on that note, this is complex stuff, and it's unfolding in real time. We hope this deep dive into this specific source material has helped you get a clearer picture of what's being reported and the different layers of analysis presented within it. Stay curious, keep those questions coming.
Absolutely. There's always more to understand in situations like this, always more digging to do.
Until next time, keep learning. And make sure you subscribe to the Deep Research Podcast to keep getting these deep dives directly to you. Thanks for listening.